Wendy, os tengo que decir que es una de las consultoras en prospectiva con una trayectoria más larga, más exitosa, con un mayor reconocimiento internacional. Wendy tiene un grado en visión y creatividad, liderazgo, visión y creatividad por la Universidad de Michigan. Sin embargo, su formación en prospectiva se desarrolló en Hawái, donde completó un máster y después se doctoró con una tesis sobre fluidez en prospectiva, que aún es muy recordada. Y después de trabajar en algunos organismos como el Center for Development Student y algunos organismos públicos, empezó a trabajar de consultora, alternándolo con la docencia, tanto en la Universidad de Houston como en otras partes. Y de un tiempo a esta parte, desde el 1988, en que funda y codirige Jigsaw Foresight, una consultora inglesa de la que vamos a hablar un poco porque fueron los que realizaron el caso que os vamos a presentar hoy. Well, Wendy, welcome. These days, I'm always starting with the first question to all our guests. So, how did you arrive to Futures Foresight?
Oh, very interesting. I was always interested in science fiction from very young, and I was always interested in inventions and technological innovation because my father was. And my father like tinkered a lot. That's probably not going to translate. He built things a lot in sort of his workshop in addition to his actual job. So I was always interested in technology. When I was in undergraduate, there wasn't really a undergraduate major that let me look at all of the complexity of how technologies and scientific innovation emerged and then played out in society. But luckily, I was in a strange little program in Michigan State University that allowed us to create our own majors, which is how I ended up with a major. My undergraduate major became philosophy, technology, and social change. And the last year I was engaged in that. All of the books that I was finding that were most interesting on the back, where a book will often have a keyword like history or mathematics or sociology, I was seeing the phrase future studies. And I thought, is that a thing? And then I went looking for graduate programs, and I found the one at the University of Hawaii. And given that when I was at Michigan State, we had two of the worst blizzards in the history of the state, I thought, yes, Hawaii, that sounds like a change. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, so I'll cough occasionally. So, and also because, quite frankly, Jim Dater wrote back the most interesting response to my, so what is it you do in your program? To cut to the chase, that ended up being about 16 years of my being first a master's student, then a PhD student, then basically research faculty doing work with the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies and the Center for Development Studies. And we did a lot of futures work with nonprofits and policy organizations, governmental organizations, both state level, national level in the territories, the Pacific Island nations, and larger intergovernmental organizations. And then when I then relocated to Oxford, because my husband, who is a historian, was offered was actually asked to create the Korean Studies program at Oxford University. He's a historian of Korea and Japan. So we relocated here. Then I ended up commuting to Houston to teach in their master's program in future studies. But when I was sort of fully here after about 5 years at Houston, I started doing work with a more expanded list of clients, basically, that included not only government agencies, large international agencies, nonprofits, and also corporations and businesses. So what we have found is that the sort of tools that we use and develop and teach people in futures research and foresight are applicable pretty much in every circumstance. They are even applicable at the individual level for planning your own life. So one of the things that I found was lacking when I looked at all the work that I and various colleagues in future studies undertook is that we would do really solid, rigorous futures work. Yes, it is possible to do rigorous futures work. And then get really creative and systemic and critical about thinking about the implications of the changes we were spotting and identifying, and maybe create scenarios of alternative possible environments that people, decisions, products, policies might face and need to adapt to, or help people articulate preferred futures that they could use as inspiration for planning change. That was all great. We could do those. People would say, thank you. What a great experience. What a great write-up. Awesome. And they'd take those reports and they'd put them on the shelf. And what we're really trying to do here is help people act to create change. And so the part we were missing, I often thought as futures researchers, was the part where we create actions for change. And that is why I now work with my colleague Victoria Ward and why we founded Jigsaw Foresight. So if that's pretty much an answer, why don't I slide into the slides? Because
Before, if you don't mind, I would also like to ask you, what do you think are the main competences or skills for a futurist or someone that does a strategic foresight?
Interesting. There are, I think, underlying skills, and then there is the level skills at the level of tools. The underlying sort of skills or habits of mind you need to have are to be what one colleague referred to as being relentlessly curious. So you always have to be looking around you and thinking, what's new? What hadn't I seen before? Why is that new thing happening? What are people challenging about the old ways we do things? So you always have to be observant and curious about the world. You need to be able to think systemically. You need to be able to identify your own inner assumptions and biases and critique them. So have a critical, reflective thinking capacity. And you need to be able to be outrageously creative and, break through boundaries in your own thinking and help other people break through theirs, because the future will surprise us. Whichever of many futures we end up in will surprise us. Aside from that, there are some specific foresight tools like that relentless curiosity gets translated into horizon scanning, which is a particular research approach to actually observing and gathering data on existing trends of change and looking for emerging changes, because that's the data we get. That's the data we get to have. We can't teleport into the future as of yet and observe it, which is what most social scientists want to do, right? Participant observation. We don't have that luxury. So we have to track change, try to spot emerging change, and the one other piece of data we can collect are people's ideas about the future. Because an assumption of future studies is that people actually act on their ideas about the future. So that's a sort of a core skill. Then again, there are various critical thinking tools about, once we've identified a change, thinking through what impacts it might have and on whom. And once you start doing that, you're already beginning to sketch kind of ideas about what sort of alternative outcomes you might get once those changes happen and their impacts start evolving. And once you get through exploring what futures we might end up in, then the next critical skill is to be very good at facilitating conversations about what people want and mapping out values and mapping out preferences or desirable futures. And then that last step is, tools to actually motivate and organize planning and action within teams, within organizations. So this is all focused on, again, getting to the point where we're supporting each other and creating change towards a more positive future, a more positive outcome, whether for our family, for our community, for our company, for our public agency, for our nonprofit, whatever it is.
Great. Let me make a comment about translation and I introduce the project. Me gustaría decir que, bueno, veo que el sistema de traducción funciona bastante bien, pero tiene algún problema con cuestiones técnicas, ¿no? Os habréis dado cuenta que cuando Wendy habla de future studies, que la traducción más correcta sería prospectiva, lo llama estudios de futuro, que no es decir mucho técnicamente. Y, por ejemplo, cuando hablaba de environmental scanning, nosotros lo llamaríamos escaneado del entorno o escaneado ambiental. Pero vaya, para los que seguís en el máster, pues una pequeño apunte. Y ahora os voy a presentar este proyecto en el que trabajamos juntos y que creo que es destacable desde muchos puntos de vista. So, Wendy, let's begin.
Okay. Sorry, yes, the other side's up. Okay, and I have an interesting design challenge here. We have 33 slides. We have another 40 minutes, and I'm aware that the translation is going to work best if I do not talk too quickly. So let's see how we make this happen. So first of all, we wanted to bring to you a case study for an international organization that illustrated capacity building in foresight tools and techniques and futures thinking, and also had a real-world application for that organization. We also happily worked together on this, so there are complete versions of the reports from this project, not only in English, but also in French and Spanish.
No,
So you can, yeah?
So far, it's only available in English. I checked it last week. The main report is only available in English. I also
They told me it was coming out.
Well, maybe in the future, but so far it's only in English. They say full report it's only available in English.
Okay, it will be available in Spanish very soon because I know they've finished doing that. And certainly a lot of the materials we have in Spanish because Jordi led a whole Spanish working group for this project. All right, so what was the project? There is something called the World Organization of Animal Health, which frankly I had never heard of until we won the contract to do this. They are connected and on the same level in the UN system as the World Health Organization. The World Organization of Animal Health is meant to have oversight on primarily animals in the human food chain as part of a policy called One Health, which basically says for people to be healthy, the things we eat need to be healthy. For them to be healthy, the environment needs to be healthy. It's all One Health. So they asked us to help them initially to help them do some environmental horizon scanning. So what are the changes we see? To help them build some scenarios and then to help them think about the future of the World Organization of Animal Health strategically. Now, the we here, and Jordi, we're going to go through these next two slides very quickly. In this case was Jigsaw Foresight, which is me and my co-founder, Victoria Ward, who is a change activation specialist, knowledge management specialist, organizational storytelling, organizational culture specialist, who has worked at very high levels in financial organizations and international organizations of various sorts. So she brings that skill set, I bring the future skill set, And then we have a whole team of associated professionals, of whom Jordi is one of our Jigsaw research fellows. We also have some people that focus on messaging, branding, stories, and multimedia approaches. So that's us. We work, and especially for this project, we work using a variety of software platforms to support what we do. We are all distributed, so we have no office, none of us lives in the same town. Because of that, we use Slack as our primary organizational communication platform. And we also use it during the beginning phases of horizon scanning when we're looking for change. For each project for which we are looking for change, we create a Slack channel. So there was a WOA scanning channel where, as we saw interesting changes that we thought were related to the world of animal health, we would drop them in the channel, discuss them to sort of say, why did you think that was related? Yes, we agree it's a change that might have a big impact. Okay, so we'll formally add it to the database. The formal scanning database, which is on Notion, which again can be shared in a very distributed way, it's essentially a spreadsheet. It's just a graphically user-friendly spreadsheet. And we keep all of our change data on that, and we can very easily give the change data specific tags like the time horizon of when we think this change is going to hit the hardest, and what category of change it is, whether it's a social change or technological change or political change, etc. We do a lot of system mapping using Kumu, that's the tree. Obviously, we have workshops we do in-person workshops, but with a very large international organization. We do exactly what we're doing here. We use Zoom, and we use Miro, which is a digital whiteboard, because we can do a lot of digital mapping of people's thoughts, and it's just a comfortable way to share a lot of worksheets with a group of people when we are working through a specific futures tool. Now, the first thing we did in this project was I sat down with the project team lead and some of the senior people in WOA and said, we are new to you as an organization and what you do. What do you do? What's your mandate? And they started talking through all of the things for which they were responsible and essentially all the parts of the food chain that they touch and parts of the economy that they touch. And as they talk, I created a system map, which Jordi is showing on this slide. And the point of doing this is to sort of say, okay, this is what WOA is concerned with right now. And these are the components of WOA that are responsible for those concerns, for creating the rules, the regulations, the oversight for those areas of the food chain. So this is sort of the system map of the issue. The next thing that we started doing was scanning. Yes, sorry, was scanning. And so again, part of what you've got here is an example of scanning using our Slack channel, where we were all putting in links to different articles of interest that talked about different changes and writing some comments on them. And then, as I said, the ones that we did think were important, we translated into a Notion database. That's this slide that looks a bit more like a spreadsheet, and it allows us to enter not only the article and the change, but some keywords associated with it, where on that system map, the domain map, we thought this change would hit. So what component of the system map a particular article or change would affect, what kind of change it is, and then whether it was an emerging change, a mature change, etc. So this allowed us to keep and to keep and sort the changes in a much more organized way. Then that we had kind of conversations. This is our own Miro board in team where we clustered some of those changes and started talking about how they fit together and would maybe reinforce each other to create a larger change or a change with greater impact. So that was just sort of thought reflection on the scanning. And then we turned those into a deliverable for the project.
Wendy, if I may, I just wanted to emphasize, because the slides are not making justice to the amount of work that was put into this. Si tenéis que ser conscientes que un equipo de unas 10, 12 personas distribuido por distintas partes del mundo, dedicamos varias semanas a buscar fuentes, a tratar de ver hasta qué punto eran relevantes. Las que nos parecían relevantes utilizando Notion, Kumu, pues las pasamos en una base de datos para que las demás lo pudieran acceder. O sea, fue una manera de procesar una cantidad ingente de información en un tiempo relativamente corto. And now sorry, Wendy, I thought it was important to emphasize that it was a lot of territory that we covered in some weeks. So you
yes, that's true. This part of the project was short compared to most horizon scanning processes. It was like 2 months at the most. And you're reminding me that I'll say what I say to everybody. Horizon scanning, collecting the data about change, and especially emerging changes, is the most time-intensive component of futures research and foresight. And therefore, if you are thinking in terms of human resources, the most expensive component.
Yeah.
Because it just takes a lot of time and a lot of talking to get to the point where you can offer people what we call change cards.
Yes.
That's yeah,
but
yeah.
I think, if just to finish this point, that it is important to also emphasize that in this case, the use of technology was very smart. It really boosted the effort of the people and make the most of the limited time we had. So really, that's why we have included the tools. Todas esas herramientas, desde Slack, que nos ofrecía un canal de comunicación estructurado y ordenado, porque ya sabéis que cuando hay gente en distintas partes del mundo, a veces es muy difícil saber qué va antes de qué. El hecho de haberle agregado estas herramientas para potenciar el procesado le daban un valor añadido que de otra manera alguien hubiese tenido que estar ahí invirtiendo horas. Y con todo eso llegamos a la creación de las tarjetas, the deliverables, the cards. So I'll give it back to you, Wendy.
Right. So, and these are actually very compressed cards. In our other work, we often create what we call postcards from the future, which have sort of more commentary than this, but we wanted to use these in a live workshop, so we wanted to keep it fairly short. As we said, the process involved the three main languages of English, French, and Spanish. So we had breakout groups in French and Spanish when we were doing the workshops, and there were 3 primary workshops that kind of built up the project as we went along. So as you can see, this each of the cards gave the change that we identified a sort of catchy title, and then briefly described the change and asked a question for them to think about, or ask several questions about what this might mean for WOA or OMSA, if we wanted to say it that way, and the work of veterinarians, because WOA is mostly made up of veterinarians and veterinary professionals, and the food chain. So that's an example of one card. We had 45. So
let's move to the first workshop, if
Yes, let's, because we are, yes. So anyway, 45 cards. And the trick was we had people from all over the world. And because they're from all over the world, we had to do each workshop twice to account for very different time zones. So one of the first things we wanted to do in the workshop was say to people, tell us where you're calling in from so that we understand that, and tell us about a change that you see happening in your local area, which was kind of a warm-up question. And the next thing we did was ask them to sort of look at the 45 changes, and we sent them the changes in advance so they can read them and familiarize themselves. And basically say, which of these changes are the highest priority for WOA/OMSA? And by that, there's a classic matrix approach we use in futures, which basically says changes can be more or less important, and they can be more or less uncertain. And let's get clear about that. Something that's perfectly certain has a probability of 80 to 100%. Something that's perfectly uncertain is 50-50. You don't know how it'll play out. So this, we asked them to sort the changes in the first workshop, where we basically said, if it's very certain, but it's not important, you know what's going to happen and you know it's not important. You can ignore it. If it's highly uncertain and currently not important, you might want to watch it because it's highly uncertain. So you don't really know how it's going to play out. And so in the future, maybe it will become important. If it is highly important and very certain, well, it's highly important and you know it's going to happen. You should have a plan. Do you have a plan? And just for a moment, let me point out that itself became an interesting discussion, where they would put changes in the we should already have a plan, and then look around and go, we don't have a plan for all of these. So that's another useful insight. And then there's the area that futurists like, which is it's highly important or potentially highly important, and we're not sure how it's going to play out. So we need to do something imaginative to explore what this might mean to us, depending upon how this change plays out or whether it happens or doesn't. So that's kind of one way to do it. We later developed an approach to this where instead of having them move the changes onto this quadrant, matrix, we created a color code for each corner of the quadrant and just had them put stickies of different colors on them. All right, so we ended up with a group of changes that were important, or they thought might be important, but were uncertain. So we had to explore them. The usual way to explore uncertain, important changes in futures is to use scenarios. So the particular approach that we took to using scenarios is one that I developed at the University of Hawaii's Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies. So we call it Manoa Scenario Building. Manoa is the valley where the University of Hawaii is located. And it basically says the future that we end up in is going to be some combination of a lot of different changes and their impacts. So an interesting approach to building scenarios is to say, okay, let's take at least 3 of these highly important changes that we're kind of uncertain about, and one by one, let's first explore each change by itself and think through its potential impacts. And we do that using something called a futures wheel, which just helps us map out impact cascades of a change. And then with Manoa scenario building, you say, well, okay, we've mapped out a lot of interesting impacts for each of these 3 changes. What does the world look like where all these changes, these 3 changes, and all their impacts are all happening, and we're living in it? And how do some of those changes and impacts start interconnecting? So this is sort of showing one group's, in fact, Journey's group's map of the interconnections of those three changes we just showed you. And that really allows people to start interconnecting the impacts, the changes, the issues of concern to WOA, and thinking about all of this systemically. What this does is generate an awful lot of details about a possible future. And it also sort of tells you what the path was to that future, because again, the future's wheels are cascades of impacts. So what we then did was say, all right, assume that all of those changes are happening, all of those impacts are happening. You're stepping into a day in that future. What does that look like? What does that mean for veterinary services? What are some of the challenges you see to health and animal well-being? What are some changes in the relationship between humans and animals? And what's the role of OMSA? What does OMSA need to be doing in this future? So they kind of thought through what the future looked like based on all of the impacts they'd mapped out and addressed those questions. And then, because this needs to be a story, we said, okay, so what are some metaphors, or if there was like a bumper sticker for this future, what would it read? How would you describe this scenario if you were sort of reporting on it like breaking news? So there are a number of sort of little helper questions we asked to start getting details to build a narrative. And that resulted in 5 different scenarios, because we had 15 important uncertain changes. And so we divided them up into 3 changes each for 5 working groups. One of the working groups worked in French, one of the working groups worked in Spanish. And so the 5 scenarios ended up varying from very positive to kind of totally apocalyptic, although even that one had a kind of upbeat ending. So eco-evolution rising was...
If I may interject, uh, this one, the Hungry Games, it's a name that has a very clear double meaning in English. We were unable to find a good translation. The official translation was just Juegos del Hambre, like the movie. But just last week, I thought that we could have used this Artura, because Artura has this feeding meaning, but also the meaning of being fed up. So it's just a missed opportunity, but I think at least for the presentation, we we could try.
Okay, could you go back to scenario 1? Okay, so part of what I wanted to do is emphasize the fact that a good set of scenarios should give you true alternatives from the present, because they're meant to challenge your thinking, and they're meant to challenge your assumptions about the present and your assumptions about business as usual and the things you think will always be with us. Because history teaches us that the one thing that is certain is that we'll be surprised by the future. And that very often, things that we think are solid assumptions do not work in the changed conditions of the future. Now, having said that, there was this range of scenarios from the relatively optimistic, which is eco-revolution rising, but even that had some downsides, because in the real world, there is no perfect outcome. So even a positive scenario should have downsides. In WOA We Trust really dealt with misinformation and mistrust in science. Hungry Games was our complete climate change, hothouse world, food chain collapses, there is famine. It is a bad scenario. And yet even in that, the ending is sort of, well, people just wouldn't sit there and sort of wait for the end. They would try and work to improve the situation. So it actually ends with, how are people coming together to address the challenges of this very dark scenario? And then, of course, you have to have a couple that are just really out there in terms of science and technology. So we had animal uh, animal production in space and use of very high tech for maintaining the food chain we have, but ensuring that it is more sustainable and resilient. Okay, how we actually built those scenarios based on what the they gave us in the workshops was, first of all, we figured out a timeline of the changes and impacts that came out of the futures wheels, and then we sort of asked ourselves, who's the hero here? Who's the who are the people that are working for the good? Where's the tension? Who are some people that are seeing an opportunity and maybe taking advantage of it in ways that may marginalize other folks, shut other people out of the food chain or food access. So we were looking for drama. You want to look for drama. You want to look for in telling these kinds of stories. You also want to look for humor. And there are a number of little details that to this day still make me laugh because you remember things that make you laugh. And scenarios should be memorable because you want to keep them in mind. So they're constantly jogging your thinking a little bit about every time you make a decision, you should be thinking, oh, but there was that scenario where future conditions might not really fit this decision I'm making. So the last set of workshops actually started asking those questions. We gave the narratives that we'd written back to our participants and said, think through what WOA needs to do in your scenario to actually help the world be a better place. Then think through how veterinary services need to change. And then, because a large percentage of our participants were from the International Veterinary Students Association. So essentially the next generation, potentially, of WOA network participants. So they were interested in the question, how should veterinary education change to make sure that we are better equipped to create a very resilient sort of situation for WOA? Now, we're going to switch gears slightly for the last few slides.
The three scenarios that made the final cut.
Yes. So, but let me talk about this. So that was actually the end of the project. Really, that was all they had initially asked us to do. However, part of the reason we did this is because it was WOA's 100th anniversary. And so this was a special 100th anniversary foresight project looking ahead to the future. Like many international organizations, WOA has a set of sort of foundation documents about that sort of set its mandate and say, this is who we are, this is what we're meant to do, this is how we do it. And I think they call them the basic texts. As part of the 100th anniversary and their 100th anniversary General Assembly of the membership, because it's an international organization, they wanted to have a conversation about whether or not they needed to review and revise the basic texts. They actually had a lawyer come in and look at them legally and do a legal analysis. And at one point in our discussions about, what can you do with these scenarios now that you've got them? I said, well, one thing you could do is basically put your basic text in each of these scenarios and say, would they still work as a mandate in different scenarios? And their comms and strategy and kind of senior leadership went, what a great idea. Can you do that for us during our 100th anniversary General Assembly? And we said, foolishly, we said yes. Okay, so I'll get to that in a second. Now, we couldn't do all 5 scenarios because there were like 1,000 people at this General Assembly. And so we had to think of some way to engage people that was very, very simple and that we could do even if they were sitting, not around a seminar table in a usual workshop situation, but sitting in an auditorium. So we chose 3 of the 5 scenarios. And the 3 scenarios were the eco-revolution rising. That was a scenario that was originally drafted in English. In What Will We Trust, which was originally in
The Spanish. That was
Spanish.
the one in the Spanish.
And then Hungry Games, which was originally in French. Because we could show people the actual thinking work that had been done in their language for each of these. Now, in this giant convention hall where they were meeting, the Spanish breakout group and the French breakout group could speak their own language, right? We just the In What Will We Trust group went off with Jordy, and who was helping you with that?
There were several participants, members of the organization that were from Spanish-speaking countries, plus some students also
Right.
speaking Spanish, sorry.
Right, who had been participants in building the scenarios. So we had some people. So Jordy went off with those folks and the Spanish-speaking participants who were interested in this to a breakout room, and they discussed. Same thing with our French facilitator and that breakout room. And I got the auditorium where they had simultaneous translation. And although I was presenting the scenario in English, it was being simultaneously translated into Mandarin, Arabic. There were 4. Mandarin, Arabic,
Russian, maybe?
Russian, and what was the last one? Maybe Japanese.
Cool.
But so essentially, I was facilitating in a situation where there were 5 languages in the room, which was interesting. And basically what we did, and I'm concerned that we're not doing too badly. All right, so what we did was we presented the scenario. And do you have the sound file?
Yes, the promise. Okay.
We'll try and play it.
O sea, al principio, cada grupo se creó un clip para poder facilitar la transición desde lo que habían estado haciendo en el presente en la asamblea hacia el escenario que se presentaba, así un poco como el principio de la Guerra de las Galaxias, ¿no? Y entonces lo que se añadió fue un paisaje sonoro para, de alguna manera, estimular la creatividad de los participantes a la hora de pensar en el futuro. Vamos a poner solo un poquito, pero os vais a hacer una idea de lo que fue.
Oh, I'm not sure we can hear it. While Jordy checks his settings. So what we needed to do was in each of our 3 rooms, explain what we were doing, right? And they had just heard the analysis of the basic text from the legal consultant, and we said, okay, we're going to present you with a further challenge of critical reflection. We're going to ask you to time travel, to step into a future and think about what you would be doing as a veterinarian, what WOA would be doing, and therefore what you'd need to tell this assembly about how the basic texts might need to be revised to be more suitable for purpose in this future. And and there was a slide in each of our cases that roughly described the scenario, and then also this soundscape. And the soundscape was meant to be a sort of immersive, meditative moment to help them switch gears from conference talk into thinking about this future. Then the first round of questions was sort of, what's your life in this future?
And it has a
And
one-to-one dialogue in this case. Each
yes,
participant should find a partner to discuss about it.
right. Then the second round, we asked those partners to find another partner set. So it became 4 people talking, and said, and basically asked, so what should OMSA be doing in this future?
And then the third round.
And then based on those conversations, we took it back to the individual and said, what would you tell participants in this session in 2024 about what OMSA needs to do to be better prepared for the future, essentially?
I think it's important to say here something that probably you won't say, but it's not that Wendy had that many people in the auditorium with several languages, which is probably the largest workshop ever held. All the participants were also estaban usando una app. Les pedimos que se descargaran una app que se creó para la asamblea y en la cual tenían que ir reportando inputs, añadiendo inputs para poder generar todo un volumen de información de todo, vamos a decir, los participantes. ¿Cuál era el problema? Que cuando entraban los participantes que estaban en la sala con Wendy, nos bloqueaban a todo porque de repente entraban 300 personas a la vez y eso creaba un poco de tapón. Con todo, fue una experiencia muy bonita porque no creo que se haya hecho nunca una experiencia con tanta gente a la vez en tantos idiomas con un apoyo tecnológico como fue el caso. I thought it was important to add several details on actually the feat that we managed to accomplish that day.
And let me assure you that we were all terrified going into this, but and overjoyed and celebrated when it was a success. And it was a success. And what was particularly important, and this speaks to something that is critical in Futures and Foresight, you have to bring diverse perspectives into the conversation. You have to bring all the stakeholders into the conversation. And the fact that this was one of the first times in one of their assemblies that the students, the veterinary students, were included was critical. It was also important because it gave a voice to them in a very, it highlighted their voice. And in the sort of summary chat, the very last panel sort of said, what have we done? What have we accomplished, in this whole assembly? And when we were summarizing what we did in the Foresight group, I sort of gave this summary of this is what we did, because not everyone in the assembly was among the 200 to 250 people that did this. So we summarized it for them. And then one of the WOA representatives who had participated talked about it. And then the young woman who is president of the International Veterinary Students Association stood up and said, what are you going to do about this? This is our future.
Yeah.
So it changed the conversation going forward, essentially. So this understanding that you have to bring, again, all the people to your futures conversation who are potentially involved in the future you're discussing is useful, especially if we're talking policy terms. Now, if we're being more pragmatic and free market economy oriented, the equivalent for a corporation, someone who is offering a service or a product, is to bring a very wide variety of potential users or consumers of the product in the room, and also to include the aspects of a community or the environment that are affected by the production and disposal of the product or the service. So there's a kind of classic facilitation exercise called "Who Speaks for Wolf?" That is an example of that. Who here in our conversations is representing nature? Whether it's animals, rivers, trees, whatever. Who here is representing the next generation? Who here is representing the seniors, the older people? Who here is representing whatever community is frequently excluded? How do we include them? So we are all together going to be living in whatever future emerges. So it's a good idea if we're all involved in discussions that help us plan for it, plan for a better future, and act to create it. So I'm going to stop there. We have 2 minutes.
No, it's the last slide to show the results. As I said, so far is only available in English, but we know for a fact that it's there's a lot of material in Spanish and French, and most of it is translated. So I suppose that eventually it will also be published in different languages.
I thought the Trends and Drivers report was out in all 3 languages, at least. That was because that was published in the fall.
It seems like they have rearranged their website, and that may be it. But at least this is available. I think it makes justice to the work done, and probably it's a milestone for their organization too.
Yes, this was the first major piece of foresight work that they accomplished. And quite frankly, the scenarios the participants came up with were creative enough and they were very different from the present. And I thought it was a great sign that our project lead in WOA, Tiana Brand, took the rough drafts of the scenario to the director general and said, "This is what our foresight project has produced as scenarios." And she said, and then I, had a meeting with her after she read them, and I was very worried when I walked into that meeting that she would tell me that, this was all foolishness. And I walked in and she said, "These are very good. I can see exactly the kinds of changes in the present that would lead to any one of these 5. How are we going to use them?" And that's the response you hope for. So,
Well, thank you, Wendy. We have done excellently well in time, so we can open the floor for questions from the participants. Actually, we already have a question from Ana Tirado. She asks, what percentage of design thinking and project development techniques do you estimate are important for the previous study of the environment in order to be able to apply foresight techniques later on? So I suppose it's introduction part we have explained at the beginning.
well, okay, design thinking works really well with foresight, but you don't need to use it at all. I mean, there are a number, like this foresight project didn't formally use any design thinking at all. We just used
Wendy, I think she means how long did it take to plan, design, and structure the project? I think.
Oh, okay. Sorry, different question. I hang out with a lot of design thinking folks, and so I was answering on a different level. That's a great question. I had to think back to when we were writing the proposal, because the actual plan for what we did not change very much from the proposal. I don't know, maybe a week of concentrated thinking, because in essence, what they were asking for is a very familiar sequence in foresight research and futures research. You do scanning, you spot changes, you prioritize those changes in terms of which ones might be particularly significant to the issue that is being discussed or the organization's mandate. You choose how you are going to create scenarios. There are over 24 different scenario building methods. We chose, the client actually chose this one because one of the more popular methods basically narrows it down to 2 changes, and she wanted to explore a wider range of potential changes than just 2. And this was also capability building. So she just wanted her team to explore a fair number of methods. And I think so maybe a week in terms of designing the project when we were writing a proposal. And then we had 2 initiation meetings. The first one, when I literally went in and sat down and said, someone needs to explain what WOA does to me because I am not well acquainted with you, where we created the system map. And also I showed her and her colleagues different approaches to scenario building. So we sort of chose one. And then there was a second initiation meeting where we actually figured out the timing in terms of inviting people to these workshops, because they were long. It was 3 to 3.5 hours per session. And we did each one twice. So we did the prioritizing the scanning data, the change data workshop in September of 2023. And we did it twice, 3.5 hours, or were they 4? They were long. And so people had to block out, all of our participants had to block out 4 hours of their time to spend on Zoom. And I know that probably sounds horrific, but actually we've put a lot of work into making Zoom sessions more humane in terms of giving people breaks and being more playful, and yeah. And then in, I think it was late November, we did the actual scenario building. Again, 2 sessions to handle all the time zones around the world of about 3.5 to 4 hours. And then it was either late January or early February of 2024, we did the scenario workshop, which I think was shorter. The strategy workshop, the what should WOA do workshop. What took more time was planning what we would do with the General Assembly, because we first came up with really, really cool things that we could do in terms of breaking people up into small groups. Because I think we were thinking we'd have maybe, I don't know, 50 people. So maybe, 8 round conference tables of 8 people each or 7 people each. And so we were planning on that basis. And then they came back to us and went, oh no, you could have 200 to 300 people. So we had to go back to the drawing board and say, what is absolutely the simplest thing that we can do? So that probably added another week to the planning. And then there was the whole really nightmare that Jordy has explained to you about they wanted to have a data entry possibility, and they used a new and untested software platform. And people were so enthused about responding that they broke it because the software platform hadn't been built to take hundreds of responses of a fairly long, like a couple of sentences each. So it was interesting. It all worked in the end. But yeah, the initial design, maybe a week.
Allow me to complement. Creo que tenéis que tener en consideración 2 aspectos muy importantes. Primero, que tanto Wendy como Victoria son personas de una gran experiencia en este tipo de trabajos. Es decir, han probado muchas maneras de trabajar con gente. Por tanto, en el momento de tomar las decisiones, podían acortar pasos porque muchas de esas veces ya tenía una experiencia previa de cómo funcionaba tal método, tal técnica. Y también creo que fue muy importante el hecho de que el interlocutor principal en la parte de la OMSA, Tiana Brand, era una persona que conocía suficiente la perspectiva, lo cual permitía que en algunos casos las conversaciones o los debates sobre qué hacer eran fáciles porque ella también entendía la implicación, las implicaciones, las consecuencias de cada opción. Por eso parece que una semana se pueda solucionar. Yo creo que en otros casos igual hubiese necesitado más tiempo porque sencillamente no se disponía del talento. Es decir, solo los miembros del equipo como James Howard o Peter Hayward, que eran los que dominaban el aspecto técnico, claro, ellos compusieron muy rápido sistemas para apoyar el escaneado, que si no cuentas con personas con ese conocimiento experto, nuevamente te implica mucho más tiempo porque tienes que probar qué hacer. Miro es una plataforma, el lienzo este digital, que es muy útil en este tipo de eventos en línea. Wendy lo ha utilizado profusamente, sobre todo en la pandemia, y claro, eso te permite en algunos momentos tener una agilidad que de otra manera es más tiempo que hay que dedicar al diseño del proyecto.
Can I address one other part of this?
Yes.
An Ivana's question, important for previous study of the environment to be able to apply perspective techniques. So I'm not sure if this is what you mean, but I am reading that to also be asking about a previous understanding of both the environment in which WOA is currently working and the environment of change. So, as I said, the first conversation we had with them was, what is your current environment? What are the challenges you faced in the past? What are the challenges you're facing now? What is that? That's what the system map was about. The study of changing in the environment. If we had in the original design, I think we had 6 weeks to do the horizon scan. That's a very short amount of time. Horizon scans are usually ongoing processes. What helped us immeasurably in doing that usually time-intensive part of the project in a short amount of time was that we had done a previous project for the Law Society of England and Wales on what's called the emerging bio age, biological, biotech, changing relationships between humans and the natural environment. So for that project, we had done a lot of scanning about changes to the environment, changes to animals, genetic engineering, a lot of sort of related changes. So we had, we already had data in our own Jigsaw Foresight scanning database that was actually applicable to the WOA project. And that's one of the things that is true when you start working in foresight, is as everyone who is a professional in futures research and foresight is constantly doing scanning just as a kind of habit of research. And once you build up a scanning database, it's easier to get started quickly on different projects with different topics because you can go back to your existing scan data and pull out a base of usable information just as a foundation to get started. Because again, scanning is the most time intensive. So however you can give yourself an advantage in getting started and in sort of preloading your scanning database, you should. And one typical way that that's done is by doing what's called a scan of scans, which means there are now enough people doing foresight and futures work all over the world in all different kinds of human organizations that it's very likely that someone may already be horizon scanning more or less on your topic of interest. So, for example, we're working on an education project right now. There has been a huge amount of work done on futures of education. So I can just go look for reports on, what are changes affecting education? And I can assemble all of those, scan pieces of scanning research that other people have done that are publicly available, and say, okay, what changes have they identified? I'll start with those as the base data set, and then I'll go looking for additional changes that may have emerged since they did that research. So that can kind of shorten your prep time as well, or shorten the investment you make in scanning.
Okay, we have other questions and comments. Carlos first makes a comment about how did we, let's say, accommodate the diversity in animal health in different countries. And then also he adds if we could find a balance between, for instance, the fact that some countries are growing in terms of population fast, where others they are aging and fertility is dropping. So I don't know what do you think we can answer, Carlos?
Okay, well, ideally, there would have been a second phase of this project where each of the people who participated in the workshops would have taken what they had learned in terms of process and futures thinking, and taken the scenarios and gone back to their home country or home region and said, in each of these scenarios, what does our country look like? Right? Which is the point at which you can say, if this is what's happening kind of globally, in the global setting of this scenario, how would that play out in our country where we do have an aging population and we have underdeveloped infrastructure in these areas, and we don't have enough people graduating from veterinary school. So we were not asked to do analysis at that level of specificity, but the participants could very easily do that. Now that they have this library of scenarios, they could go back and engage in that. So that was answering the second part of the question. The first part was
Accommodating
participants.
yeah, well, it was more than a question. It was a comment about that every country has a different animal health reality or situation, but it's kind of the same that you have been answered before.
Well, and also that's why we deliberately invited and tried to hold the interest and engagement of people from all over the world, so that they could come in and say, well, you're up in Sweden and you're saying, this is what your big concern is, but we're down in Argentina and we're worried about something entirely different. And so that emerged in the discussions in the working groups, especially when we were doing that part where, when we were having the discussions about which of these changes are important. Because in fact, some people were saying, well, this change is going to have a huge impact, and other people would say, no, it's not. And then they would get into a discussion in their breakout group and realize that that difference was because of the different conditions in their country. And then when we were building the scenarios and people were sketching out, again, impact cascades from the three changes they were looking at, their concept of what an impact was informed by their local context. So that that level of detail kind of got built in by the participant contributions as we were kind of fleshing out the scenarios.
If you allow me, dejadme que os dé un ejemplo de esto. Por ejemplo, había una de las tarjetas sobre el tema del transporte de animales vivos, de ganado vivo, que en algunas partes del mundo empieza a ser un problema porque en la medida que la temperatura aumenta, pues eso pues, supone una merma, sobre todo porque muchos animales mueren. Ah, Resulta que este es un tema muy importante, por ejemplo, en Australia, ¿no? Y entonces se notó mucho que en un taller teníamos bastante gente de Australia y esa tarjeta a mí me sorprendió que subiera porque para ellos era un tema, porque tienen una manera de producción extensiva, ¿no? A veces tienen grandes rebaños esparcidos o distribuidos en zonas amplias, los agrupan para transportarlos y los llevan en camiones, ¿no? Camiones que a veces sufren mermas, ¿no? Ese tema era realmente una de las razones de hacer el proyecto como se hizo. Es decir, encontrar maneras de poder integrar esa diversidad en una organización que es mundial y que por tanto, como vean la gente de Sudamérica la propuesta del One Health, una salud, ese articular desde la salud humana a la salud animal y teniendo en cuenta que al final la salud humana depende en gran medida del bienestar de los animales, pues en Sudamérica se veía de una manera y en otras partes del mundo se veía de otra, ¿no? Y Carlos has made another comment about food, about we discussed it about the importance of food, and yes, it was a very important thing because that's one of the main, let's say, areas of interest for WOHA, how we can secure food production and how we can make food production safe. Maybe you want to add something, Wendy, in this part.
Well, and I think the other, and this also relates to the sort of local context. It's about their ongoing responsibility is maintaining safety in the food chain while at the same time maintaining the health and well-being of the animals in the food chain. And that includes wild animals that are in our food chain. So it includes marine habitats. One of the interesting dimensions to the scenario conversations was the fact that, again, local context matters. So what's the future challenges will challenge different people's food chains differently. So, for example, there was concern for a while that there was sorry, this is not animals, but it's food chain. There was concern for a while that there was a wheat rust that was proliferating around the world that could severely damage wheat crops, which is more important in some areas of the world than others. There is currently concern that the increase in temperature, among other things, is going to cause an increase in the uptake of arsenic in the soil into rice. Think about how many people in the world rely on rice as their staple grain. But not all of them are in the same place. I mean, there are folks in the world that could easily give up rice and would not care. So again, if you think about the difference between, in animal terms, the people that rejoice in the pig as a food animal versus the people who cannot go anywhere near it, versus cattle, versus fish, versus so one of the issues was, in each particular future, a question you could ask yourself is, what does this particular future mean for the parts of the food chain that are particularly significant in my culture? And the only future that was basically challenging everybody across the board was Angry Games, because that was a food chain collapse future. So at that point, it's not so much, what is it doing to sheep versus pigs versus cattle? It's, is anyone finding anything to eat at all? So it was an interesting project because it actually allowed us to really explore a lot of different dimensions in terms of local context. That didn't all get reflected in the report you'll read because the scenarios had to be global scenarios. But the way they get applied, they can be applied locally to ask those questions about, in this global context, what does it look like for us?
But if I may complement, let me switch to Spanish. Creo que una de las cosas que sí se consiguió en este proyecto fue que los participantes entendieran hasta qué punto los distintos aspectos están interrelacionados. Es decir, por ejemplo, según qué perspectiva adoptes, se puede pensar que el camino más sensato, más necesario, es apostar por una producción aún más industrial, ¿no? Es granjas de estas intensivas, monocultivos por kilómetros y kilómetros cuadrados, pero eso también tiene implicaciones. Eso también acaba siendo un problema de contaminación y de insostenibilidad. Entonces, entender que no habían atajos y que cada propuesta conllevaba beneficios, pero también costes y que se tenían que equilibrar. Yo creo que eso fue algo que se consiguió, ¿no? Además, contar con gente que en su mayor parte tenían un alto conocimiento técnico de la realidad sobre la que hablábamos, en este caso ayudó, porque no era como a veces pasa en algunos círculos en que la gente opina sin saber mucho. Ahí la mayoría de los que intervenían lo hacían con conocimiento de causa y sabían de lo que hablaba cuando hablaban pues, de una plaga o de un impacto de un tipo de producción, etcétera, etcétera. Con lo cual se demostró otra máxima no escrita del trabajo del analista, que es que aprendes un montón. Es decir, los que hicimos el trabajo hemos aprendido muchísimo sobre estas cuestiones y esperamos que las personas con las que trabajamos ahora hayan desarrollado también un poco una visión más a medio o largo plazo. Bueno. Wendy, I don't know if you have been able to read the translation of my intervention, but
No, it comes across in Spanish,
oh,
which
I
is
see.
interesting.
Okay. I was emphasizing the fact that the participants had knowledge, expert knowledge, which made the debate very learning. That we learn a lot, and that we put a lot of effort in making sure that everyone involved would understand that every single measure may have advantages, but it also has costs, and they had to be taken into account at the larger picture. I see there are a couple of comments. There's a question from, well, maybe you want to complement before, Wendy?
No, that's fine. I was just looking at Ori's question. And I can give a quick answer to that. Yes, we were looking at the scanning report included trends and drivers, trends and emerging changes that we're looking at more ecological and sustainable approaches to food production. And some of that got built into scenario 1, Eco-Revolution Rising, specifically about resilience and more sustainable food systems. And in a different way into the 5th scenario that I, for some reason, do not remember the name of, that it basically was focused on using AI more in terms of, not in terms of like big industrialized farming, but in terms of
farming for
monitoring. Yeah, it was farming for
resilience.
Right, and it was looking at using AIs to link monitoring systems that would monitor the quality of the environment in order to ensure, again, that the food chain was healthy from kind of soil up to food animals. So it did it was a dimension that was considered. Yes. Thank you for the question.
And yes, we certainly also included different kinds of production, organic, less industrial. So actually, it was a very thorough work that, of course, when distillating it into on 5 3 scenarios, uh, part of this richness was a little bit lost. But that's bound to happen whenever we do analysis. We need to emphasize the important parts, and somehow the rest can be made available, but you cannot put everything at the same level.
Yes, I suggest you read the scenarios. We put a lot of work into writing them, and there are some amusing components. In the Hungry Games scenarios, one of the things that that still makes me smile is the fact that before the food chain collapse happened, multiple AIs that were environmental monitoring AIs, kind of on a global level, tried to warn humanity that they were approaching a tipping point cliff edge, and essentially the politicians ignored them. Great detail. So yeah, we had the participants gave us a very creative set of outputs from the scenario building workshop that were easy to write, or relatively easy to write into narratives. Because that's another thing, is the point of the scenario building workshop is for the participants to have a lot of input in exploring what kind of futures a selection of changes might create, and to generate a lot of details about what those futures might look like. But it's not possible to write by committee. So at some point, you have to turn all of the material that gets generated in a breakout group or in a workshop over to someone who's just going to sit down and turn it into a story. And that also is a bit time intensive. So I imagine each of us, the scenarios weren't all that long, maybe 2 or 3 pages, but I would say each of us probably took a couple of days to do that, just because there was a lot to condense and organize in terms of detail. But yeah, it was fun.
I've just put the link of the final report in English for the time being, so you can look at it. I think it's interesting. I think we should finish. It's almost 7:30. I think the translating experiment has worked reasonably well, although a couple of times it has been funny. You maybe haven't noticed, Wendy, but when at some point you say WOHA/OMSA, and it has translated as if WOHA kills, eliminates, OMSA. Instead of saying WOHA /OMSA, is the double meaning sometimes. But I found that, as you said, some humor also helps to remember these kind of things.
Sorry, did you answer the Ori's longer question?
Well, you have done it, part of it, haven't you?
I think so. Signals indicating ongoing sabotage of food infrastructure by competing countries. Quite frankly, what's currently sabotaging U.S. Agriculture at the moment is our president. So, hey, U.S. is actually a breadbasket. I mean, China needs too much food to sabotage other people's food infrastructure. So
Not only to mention
that's never good. Yeah,
it's buying. I mean,
exactly.
for instance, I have explained several times the part of the place where I live, Catalonia, a region in Spain, produces lots of pig, and the main buyer is China. And China has no reason to stop buying or to sabotage the production. So that is something that it's mostly done by other countries, not really China. China buys and knows that, but buying gives them a lot of power over these countries.
And I'm going to work backwards. So Horizon Scanning Database, we talked about some of the tools we like using. We generally like to have a running stream, a channel in our Slack, our organizational Slack uh, platform on scanning, just because it keeps us all in the conversation, and someone, even if a team member isn't directly working on a project, they might see something related to the topic of that project that the rest of us haven't seen, so they can toss that in. We use Notion because it enables us to tag. So, for example, we ended up with, I don't know, probably something like 600 entries for the WOA database. I mostly was interested in emerging changes, and so I just told it to sort out all the emerging changes, and then started looking at things that were particular to some of the key WOA areas of activity. So Notion is nice because it allows you to sort things, and because it's a graphically oriented interface on the database, you can keep all your scanning in a database, but then you can create another Notion page essentially that looks more like those postcards, so that it itself becomes a deliverable to the client, which is, and also the database is a deliverable. I mean, we pulled together all of that information about change and then said to WOA, you have access to this. You may find other things in this that's useful. Feel free to sort and play and look at it. So we we um, we really find it pretty useful. There are so many different ways to do scanning. There are some purpose-built Foresight software platforms like the Futures platform that you pay for, um, and lets you organize scanning and even tap into other people's scanning teams. There's sort of a shared common space for scanners. So there are a number of different Foresight platforms. I can have Jordy pass on to you a list of them. It's just how much do you want to pay? What sort of activities do you want them to support? Notion is a fairly simple, straightforward database, and we use it for other things as well. So we're using that. And Foresight and Futures Literacy Evolving in the Next Decade. Wow, we have whole conferences on that topic. And what we see, I mentioned design thinking, is more and more merging of a lot of the creative approaches to planning, designing, um, innovation are being incorporated into Foresight. So we have transition design and design thinking and speculative fiction and speculative futures and design futures, and so all of that is futures research moving into a wider variety of media and experiential and participatory ways of bringing a lot of people into the conversation. I mean, in its early years, like many academic disciplines, and in fact, most academic disciplines still, it was very report oriented, right? Assemble a database, write a report. It's a document. You hand it out. Scenarios were written scenarios. These days, scenarios could be museum exhibits, scenarios could be movies, scenarios could be virtual experiences, scenarios can be expressed as artifacts of the future. It's one of its main spaces of evolution, I think, is into tapping a lot more senses than just our eyes. There is also the issue facing all professions of AI and incorporating AI. Have I used AI myself? Yes, I actually used AI to generate some scenarios for a project, and I had to feed ChatGPT basically a prompt that was so detailed that it was one step away from me writing the scenario anyway. And it produced a well-written scenario written with about the level of emotional maturity and sophistication of a really smart, high school student. Which meant I had to, it was kind of an interesting starting point, but we ended up having to edit it anyway. And then the other question you have to ask, if you're using AI as part of your futures research in any way at all, as part of any kind of research, is how much electricity and water is being used up by this one prompt that I am entering into ChatGPT. Because there are environmental consequences to our enchantment with AI, and that isn't considered often enough.
Wendy, thank you very much for the generosity of your time explaining things, but we should finish. Maybe we should plan for a future masterclass in some of the subjects that you have started. Bueno, amigos, vamos a dejarlo por hoy. Nos hemos alargado un poco más. La verdad es que Wendy sabe tanto que cuesta decidir dónde cortas porque siempre tiene cosas interesantes para decir. En cualquier caso, ha sido un placer teneros a todos y nada, hasta la próxima. Como ya vais a ver anunciados, tenemos nuevas interesantes masterclass en cantera. Un saludo a todos. Hasta la próxima.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.